Well, Pixie, I have a question for you. Hey, do you know why the cowboy wanted to buy a dachshund? Because he wanted to get a long little doggy. Yeah, oh, hey y'all. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the groups of the West and the people that were involved in the expansion of the U.S. out there. Yes, I know. So what you need to do is make sure you've got your graphic organizer. It should look a little bit like this. The group names will be on the left side, and we're going to be able to talk about the key events, the key people, government policy and laws, and cultural characteristics as we're going through this today. So the first thing I think that's important is for you to understand what we mean when we say the West. So let's look at this map here really quickly. The first part is going to be this Great Plains region, which is mostly the middle of the United States. This is going to be Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, etc. Moving on towards California. Just a couple things to point out. So first of all, if you look up here, what's in blue are not official U.S. states as yet. They are official U.S. territories, but they are not states. What is down here in green, you may recognize as what is modern-day Oklahoma. This is also not officially a state, and it's not really U.S. territory either. It was set aside in the 1800s by Andrew Jackson when he moved the Cherokee Indians from Georgia to the west during the Trail of Tears period. So this is what they would call in this time period as Indian territory, and that's going to be kind of where a lot of this conflict takes place. So kind of keep that in mind as we're talking through this here. So the first group we're going to talk about are the American Indians and kind of the conflicts between the U.S. military and the white settlers in the West. So the first thing that you really should understand about the American Indians is that there is a huge clash of culture between the Native Americans and the white settlers. Because here's what you have to remember. Plains natives are nomadic. They don't settle. They move around, mostly because they're following the herds of buffalo in that area. And they don't have a concept of owning land. Whereas when the Americans come out west, they claim this territory, establish these farms, and they don't take kindly to Native Americans crossing their territory. You also have the U.S. government, who really has to find something to do with the military. And around this time, it's the end of the Civil War. They've got to have something for the military to do. There's a lot of veterans who need work. So what they decide to do is to send the military into the West to kind of try to control the Native American population out there. So that's kind of where we stand. So when you look at this here, this map shows us the Indian Wars that took place out west. So if you look carefully, you see again some of the names of some of the Native American tribes, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Nez Perce. But if you look very carefully, what you'll see are these crossed swords. Each of these crossed swords represents a different battle that took place in the American West. So as you notice, there are quite a few of them. But we're going to focus really on just 3 major events that took place. So as we talk about the events, I'll put the key people on here as well that go with each of them. You might want to draw lines connecting just so you know where they go. So the first one is the Sand Creek Massacre. So Sand Creek is in Colorado, and it's also where the Black Hills are, which is a religious site to very many Native American groups. The problem is gold was discovered there. And so when gold was discovered, a lot of white settlers came into that territory, and it caused a lot of conflict between the locals, native groups, and those white settlers. The militias were sent out to keep the peace. However, there was one guy who was in charge of the Colorado militia named Colonel Chivington. Colonel Chivington did not like Native Americans because his family had been murdered by a group of natives many years before. And he believed that the Native Americans in Sand Creek area were going to be attacking some of the white settlers. So he and his men went in and massacred over 175 natives. It was a peaceful village. It happened while many were asleep. Men, women, children, babies, all killed. It was a really terrible event, which, as you can imagine, led to a lot of uprisings between some of the other Native American groups who really wanted revenge for this. And remember, it all happened in the name of gold. Little Bighorn, the Battle of Little Bighorn, happens not long after, and it happens because of 2 Native Americans of the Sioux tribe. So on the side of the American military, we have General Custer. He had been a war hero during the Civil War, and now led a cavalry unit out in the west. On the side of the Sioux, we have Sitting Bull, who was the chief of the Sioux, and a warrior named Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse decided that they didn't like that the whites were out there taking a lot of their land and territory. So they decided that they were going to get a coalition together of some of the local tribes and put together an army, essentially. And Custer and his men were going to try and stop it. So Custer's cavalry numbered about 250 men. What they didn't realize is that the Native Americans had been able to recruit almost 2,000 men. It's a pretty unfair battle, right? Custer and all of his men are killed in this battle, and it becomes a major outcry to the American people. It really only served to make the natives seem like the savages that most people already thought that they were, and there was a lot of cry for revenge among the American people. And that revenge came at the Battle of Wounded Knee. So the background from Wounded Knee is that there is a Native American named the Prophet, and the Prophet basically was attempting to start kind of a new religious cult. And there was an old religious ritual called the ghost dance. And he believed that if he performed this ritual, that it would drive the white settlers out of the area. So he got a group of people together, and they were conducting this ritual. The military goes in and slaughters every single one of them. Again, men, women, and children, unarmed natives. And it's a terrible tragedy for the Native Americans in that area. So I just want to show you a couple pictures here really quickly. So this is a painting done of Custer's last stand. And if you look, you can see Custer here in the middle and his men surrounding him. Right as they're about to die, you can see the natives charging them in the background. This painting is really meant to show Custer and his men as heroes that are being killed innocently by the natives. And it really served as a way, paintings like this really served as propaganda so that the American people would kind of go against some of the natives in the area. This particular photograph actually is of the aftermath of Wounded Knee. And as you can see here, they are burying the bodies of the dead in a mass grave. What I think is interesting, let's look at these men in the background. So these are the soldiers here in the background. This man here is pointing his gun at the bodies of the victim in case one of them might still be alive. He's ready to shoot them. So I think that this photograph really shows kind of the seriousness of what was going on here. And you might ask, why isn't the government stepping in? Well, they did, but they didn't really do a whole lot. The first thing that they do is establish a reservation system. So the reservation system actually dates back to the early 1820s with Andrew Jackson when he moved the Cherokees out of Georgia into Oklahoma. And the idea of the reservation system is that you set aside land that is specifically for Native Americans to live on in the hope that it won't cause conflict. The problem is these Native Americans are nomadic. They're not used to settling on land. And not only that, they're putting them on kind of the worst land that they possibly could. On top of that, it actually goes into breaking a lot of treaties that had been signed, such as the Fort Laramie Treaty, where they had actually promised to set aside some of this land in the West for natives. Instead, what they do is start land grabbing. You can see this is a poster over here saying that the Indian land is for sale, come buy your farm. So that it's land that they've taken, the Indians have been promised, and they're now selling it to white settlers as they're moving out west. And it becomes a major issue, and it really impacts the way of life. But probably the thing that impacted their way of life the most is the Dawes Act. So remember this one. The Dawes Act attempts to make the Native Americans more like the rest of America, or what we call Americanization. So what they would do is they would take the reservations, divide them up, make them live in homes instead of in what the log houses or the teepees that might normally have lived in. They say that now you're farmers. You have to cut your hair, your long hair. You have to dress like white men. They even took their children away, saying that you're not fit to raise your own children. And the children were put in boarding schools so that they could be taught the way of the rest of America, taught to be civilized, taught Christianity and other things. So some of these photographs here just to show you. So this is what a more traditional group of Native Americans might look like in their traditional clothing. Whereas here what we see on the left, adults who have been forced to put on American clothing. You can see some of the men have their hair cut or grown facial hair, which is pretty unusual for Native Americans. The women in these big hats and these high-necked gowns. Most of them don't look very happy about it. Over on this side, you can see children who've been taken away from their families and forced to live in boarding schools. At the top, those two girls have obviously been Americanized in their clothing and their hair. But at the bottom, you can see they're probably very new to the boarding school. They still look very much like the native, like the traditional native in their garb there. So the way of life was really impacted for these Native Americans, and primarily that's because of their reliance on the buffalo that they had. So the buffalo really is what the life of the Plain Indians revolved around. The problem was, when the railroads started to move out west, railroad workers hired men to shoot the buffalo so that they could build these tracks, because they said the buffalo are getting in the way. It became almost sport for these guys to shoot these buffalo, and eventually going to lead to starvation of the Native American groups. So much so that some even willingly go to live on reservations to keep their families alive. And if you might wonder, like, what's the big deal about the buffalo? Well, you can see that they really used everything. The hide, the internal organs, the hooves, the tail, the horns, everything is used in some way or another. You can almost think of the buffalo as like the Walmart on hooves, where everything you could possibly need is right there. And so this is what they live on. And then what they live on is disappearing. And even today, it's still an endangered species. So as you can see, lives of the natives were really impacted for the worse with this westward expansion. So the next group I want to talk about here today are the Cowboys. So really, there's nothing more American than a cowboy, right? That's what we think of. Here's the thing. Cowboy culture really only lasts about 30 years. It's very short-lived. So you might wonder why it becomes such a big deal. What happened? Where did it come from? It actually dates back to Mexico. There's a lot of influence from some Mexican traditions there. But it really got a big start because of the Civil War. So while the men were off fighting the war, women were back home in the ranches, and they didn't really know what they're doing. They hadn't been trained to ranch cattle. So the next thing you know, there's a huge population boom of cattle. There are all these cows. And the men get home and they're like, what the heck are we supposed to do with all these cows? So they realize that if they can get the cows to the railroads, they can sell them for money up in the Midwest, in Chicago, where the meatpacking plants are. But they can't leave their own ranches and take the cows up themselves. It's a long way, miles, hundreds of miles to take their cows. So what they do is they hire young men who are unemployed and pay them to walk the cattle to the railroad stations, where they can then be transported up into the West, and they'll get their payout there at the railroad station per head of cattle. So essentially what they're doing is being the middlemen between the ranchers and the meatpacking industry. So this way of lifestyle, their goal really is to get those cattle to the railroads. And like I said, this lifestyle lasts for about 30 years. And what happens, in order to kind of bring an end to this, is in 1883, there's a series of droughts, which makes it hard for the cows to actually survive. The weather gets really bad. There's massive blizzards, other bad storms that happen in the late 1880s that really inhibit the ability to get those cows up. But really what tips it off is the invention of barbed wire. So here's the thing about the West. In the middle of the Great Plains, there are no trees, right? It's just big open field, what you might hear called the open range, right? So it was pretty easy at first to walk the cattle from the ranches to the railroad stations. But once farmers use barbed wire and start putting up these fences, suddenly it gets harder to walk hundreds of head of cattle through these fences. And so barbed wire really brings an end to the open range because they cannot move their cattle. So this is going to be a big issue for a lot of the cowboys, and like I said, really brings an end to the cowboy era. However, as we talked about, that's still something that lives on. So the first person that I want to mention to you is Joseph McCoy. He ran the stockyard in Abilene. So basically what they would do is they'd take their cows to the stockyard, and Joseph, or whoever was in charge of whatever stockyard they went to, would pay out per head of cattle, okay? So you may have this image in your head of the Wild West. this is actually where this comes from. So let's think about this for a second, okay? Got these young men, single, right, in their 20s. They just got paid. They got a big payday, right? They got some cash on them. While these towns start popping up everywhere, what are they going to spend their cash on? You know, they live a pretty lonely lifestyle. All they really have is their horse. So maybe they're looking for some company, maybe some ladies in the evening, some alcohol. And hey, you mix alcohol and weapons, they've all got guns. Bad things are going to happen, right? That's where we get this image of the wild, wild west, right? Because, again, mixing weapons and alcohol and young men, explosion. Okay. You also, like I said, might be wondering how this lifestyle goes on. And part of that is because of a guy named Buffalo Bill Hickok. So Buffalo Bill was a cowboy, but he decided when the cowboy era started to decline, he was going to kind of idolize it. So he started what's called a Wild West show. And it's kind of like if you've ever been to medieval times, you know, like they have a lot of the play acting and that sort of thing. That's basically what they would do. And he hired former cowboys, ranchers, sharpshooters, really anybody he could find to kind of show off, right? So you might have heard of like Annie Oakley or Calamity Jane. They got their start through Wild Bill's show. Even Sitting Bull was hired on by Wild Bill as almost some sort of like side act. It's actually pretty sad that they would just kind of show off the Native Americans in these shows. But these shows became super popular on the East Coast and even in Europe. He traveled internationally with these shows, and it really helped kind of spread the legend of the Wild West and the cowboy. And that's really why this idea of the Western survives today. So in terms of the military policies and legislation, there's not a whole lot that's involved, but what's really important is that the government gave land to the railroad companies, and the railroad companies are going to sell off that land, which really allows for more people to come in. And see, here's the thing about cowboys. Without railroads, there would be no cowboys, okay? Because they're taking the cows to the railroad stations. So that's a pretty big deal. So when the government gives these lands for the railroad companies to grow, when they start to expand, the need for cattle expands. So that's kind of where that comes from. So when you think about the cultural characteristics, going back to like this idea of the Wild West, it's pretty typical what you would think of, you know, the boots, the spurs, the chaps, you know, the loneliness on the open range and, you know, sitting around the campfire at night, maybe watching your cattle and home on the range where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Right? So it's pretty typical what you think of with the cowboys here. So again, this idea of the Wild West really kind of grows because of that. All right. Next group we're looking at here are the miners. So the miners actually get their start in the West in the early 1800s, going back to the gold rush of 1848, where all along the West Coast in California, Nevada, and Colorado, there are gold strikes. Rumors of gold get back to the East Coast, and suddenly there are flocks of people who are coming to the West to look for gold to make it rich, right? So you might have heard these people called the 49ers, not the football team, right? But that's where the football team gets their name from. Sometimes it would be families, but most often it's going to be young men or veterans from the Civil War who are down on their luck and have nowhere to go, looking for, you know, a way to make their way in the world. Like I said, occasionally some families are going to go out there, but very, very few. Mostly it's going to be single men. And of course, these single men are going to live in towns in the West, and this is part of, again, that Wild West persona. Is you've got these single men, maybe they've struck it rich, maybe they haven't. They're going to need some way to either spend their money or drown their sorrows, and that's where this Wild West ideal comes from. The real problem is because this is not officially a United States, because it's not a state yet, there's no real government out there. So in these Wild West towns, and in these mining towns and specifically, we get this kind of like vigilante justice. So think like Wyatt Earp or Batman, right? So these volunteers, these sheriffs who are gonna, you know, there's this town ain't big enough for the two of us kind of thing. that's a real thing, right? So if you've ever watched like a Western or something, you've seen this. It's pretty typical, and again, pretty accurate. In terms of the type of mining that would happen in the West, there are a few kinds. So surface mining is like, oh look, there's a piece of gold on the ground that I can pick up. That's kind of the easiest, but also the hardest, in the sense that it's hard to find. Panning is what you might have done as a kid if you ever went to one of those like panning places where you stick your plate into the water and there's a sieve at the bottom or a mesh at the bottom and all the sand and water runs through it and you can find like the little gemstones. So that was a pretty common way. There's something called sluicing. That's similar. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. They would also build mine shafts. Sometimes these mine shafts were really deep, really hard to get to, and was pretty dangerous. In fact, this whole lifestyle was very dangerous, and very few ever struck it rich, found any gold. Usually once somebody got a vein of it, it ran out pretty quickly, and the supply was much smaller than the demand. And as I was saying a while ago, these mining towns pop up all over the West that are going to become your stereotype of the Wild West town. So here's a picture of gold panning again. You might have a dish into the river there. This one you can see, it's got the mesh at the bottom. The water is going to run through it. The current of the water is going to push it out, push all the sand and silt out, and leave the heavier rocks and hard metals behind. Okay, so the next group that we have here are the laborers and the workers. Primarily, we're talking about the railroad. So right after the Civil War, the railroad companies start to boom. And in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad meets in Promontory Point, Utah, right here in the middle. So there were two different railroads. There was the Union Pacific Railroad, which ran east to west, so you can see from Missouri here to right here in Utah. Then there was the Central Railroad, which went west to east from California to Utah. Now you might be looking at this here going, well, the Central Railroad looks like they're pretty lazy. But you have to remember, these guys are blasting through the Rocky Mountains. That's not an easy task. You're literally blowing up a mountain, right? So they had a long way to go. This is a big deal because this is the first continuous connecting railroad in the United States. It makes travel across the country much easier. It leads to time zones because now we realize that the sun is in different places in different parts of the world. So time zones come out because of that. When they met, it was a big deal. There had been this big contest about who was going to get there first, and you can see that these are both sides of the railroad here. So the Central on this side and the Union on this side, they're toasting each other with champagne, shaking hands, meeting. President Grant actually ran a golden spike into the ground to signify it, and one spike was connected to a telegraph wire, so as soon as it was hit into the ground, news all over the country went that this railroad had been completed. So that's a really big deal. So eventually the Transcontinental Railroad is going to expand to railroad lines all over the country. Now in terms of the key people, the laborers who are working on the railroad are primarily Irish men working from the east and Chinese working from the west. You may notice something. These are not Americans, right? These are mostly immigrants who are working on the railroads. These are hard jobs and they're dangerous jobs, and they're not jobs that a lot of Americans wanted to take. And so a lot of immigrants ended up working on the railroad because of that. Now, however, there is one group of Americans who were willing to take these jobs. A group of Americans who were pretty disenfranchised in the country and didn't have a lot of other options. I bet you can guess what I'm talking about. African Americans. So a lot of former slaves also go into work on the railroad, which leads to a lot of myths and stories about different men. You might have heard of John Henry as a folk hero. And that all comes from the work on the railroad. Now, there's a major problem with the railroads, however. The government really missed out on their opportunity to regulate. So they give the lands to the railroad companies. We mentioned that already. But the problem is they don't regulate the railroads. So different companies start using different size gauges. So they don't meet, right? So a gauge is this big wooden part right here that connects the rails. Some companies use really small ones. Some companies use really big ones. So a train that could go on the small ones couldn't go on the big ones. That's an issue, right? Eventually, that's going to be solved by a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who makes his living on a monopoly of what would become the standard railroad gauge. Now, in terms of the cultural characteristics of railroad workers, there's a lot of digging, a lot of dynamite, a lot of low pay. Like I said, this is a job that not many Americans wanted because it was incredibly dangerous and you didn't get a lot out of it. These guys are living in railroad bunks that are basically just shacks thrown together by the sides of the tracks. There's no privacy. It's a hard life that you might not even survive from. If you're blasting through mountains, there's a really big possibility that you can die. So it was a really hard life for these guys. The last group that we're talking about, finally, sorry this video is going a little long, but it's the farmers. So in terms of the key events for the farmers, this is pretty much it. Farmers are good old people, man. They're not really doing a whole lot. They're just living their life out in the West, going on doing what they need to do, right? There's not really any key events here. In terms of the people, if you've ever read or seen Little House on the Prairie, you might have a kind of general idea of what a life was like for a farmer out here. Families are the key to farming. In fact, if you don't have a family, you're not going to be a very good farmer. Men can't do this by themselves. They can mine, they can work on the railroad, they can be cowboys. They can't be farmers by themselves. You need a family in order to run your farm. And women play a really big role in farms. They keep house, they educate the children, they prepare the food, they make the clothing. Really, they keep the farm running steady. And in fact, if your wife died, you'd probably remarry relatively quickly just to make sure you can keep your farm running. Now, in terms of the government policies, the government was really trying to encourage people to move out west. So in 1862, they passed what's called the Homestead Act. So the Homestead Act offered 160 free acres of land to anyone that would move out west. The key is they had to live on that land for 5 years and improve it. Whether they, toiled the soil, whether they, did some sort of new cattle breeding or something. They just had to make it better, and they could keep that land for the rest of their lives. So as you can imagine, this opens a lot of opportunity for, again, people who wouldn't normally be able to buy 160 acres of land, like poor whites, African Americans, even a lot of immigrants. Another thing that they do is that they establish colleges across the country to kind of encourage research of agriculture. This is through the Morrill Act. And the idea here is that they want to improve agriculture. They want to improve breeding of plants and animals in order to get the best possible crops that they can get. This leads to the founding of NC State. That's where they founded. That's why their agricultural department, even to this day, is still great. So you can see here that there is some photographs of the early campus of NC State. This is the very first freshman class of NC State here. And their job, as I said, is to try and improve and research the new agricultural techniques. And that's funded partly by the Hatch Act. So this is money that the government gives to these new colleges in order to fund this research and crossbreeding and other sort of things. So they do work really hard to try and improve agriculture across the country. Even today, in those states in the Midwest, farmers are the key. They are the ones still there. They are the ones still working the land. Even though 1% of people are farmers today, most of them live in that one part of the country, and it's very important because every time you eat a piece of bread, you can think of farmer. There you go. Last thing I want to talk about are the cultural characteristics of farmers. So when you move out west and are planning to do this homestead thing, it's not easy, right? So the first thing that you do is you have to build a house. But look at these pictures. There's no trees on the prairie. So what are you going to use to build your house? Well, you're going to use dirt. They build sod houses. I don't know if you guys garden. I garden. Dirt is yucky, right? Like there are bugs and snakes and other gross things that are going to be in your homes. If you look at this photograph here, you'll notice that they have some wood in the door and in the ceiling. They probably took apart their wagon for that in order to build their houses. Another kind of house they would build is a dugout. So rather than just building the sod up, they would build into a hill or a cliff of some kind. So basically they're digging their way into the hill. But same thing, it's an earthen home full of critters and pests and all kinds of other little things. Obviously, a big part of being a farmer is the new technology that comes out, such as the plow and the reaper. You can't farm without them. They would also use windmills. Windmills are really important in order to pump water from distant streams or lakes, because there's no guarantee of rain, right? So you've got to be able to get water in somehow, and that's what the windmills would do for you. So I want to wrap up by looking at what I feel like may be the best photograph of a Western family ever. So you can see in this picture, this is a dugout. You see how it's dug into the hill there, which is why the cow is standing on the roof. He's not really on the roof, he's on the hill. But still, your cow's munching on your roof there. There's obviously some sort of special occasion. They've got everybody lined up outside of the house. They even brought their table out, and they've got a watermelon that they've got on that. This guy right here is just totally chilling, right? Like, he's cool. They've lined up their horses and their dog as part of the family. This really exemplifies what life in the West was like. Family was really important. Even your animals played a big part in your life. Well, that wraps it up. I know that was a long video. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the West, and I will see you later. Goodbye.